Scarlett Johansson has never been the type to tiptoe around sensitive topics, but what she pulled off on Saturday Night Live had even seasoned Hollywood insiders raising their eyebrows. Under the glaring studio lights, with a live audience buzzing and millions watching from home, she stepped up to the mic and took aim at Prince Harry and Meghan Markle with a level of precision that felt less like comedy and more like a cultural verdict. Her delivery was smooth, with every pause calculated, each punchline landing like a well-placed uppercut. The crowd roared. But beneath the laughter, there was an edge, a collective recognition that the joke wasn't just funny, it was true. From the start, Johansson made it clear she wasn't going to dance around the obvious. She painted Harry and Meghan not as misunderstood ex-royals navigating a cruel world, but as self-appointed celebrities milking a never-ending victim narrative. The opener set the tone. Netflix's favorite ex-royals turned full-time complainers. The audience didn't just laugh, they erupted. The kind of laughter that comes when the truth has been sitting in plain sight and someone finally says it out loud. Then came the sharper jabs. Meghan, she said, could turn a royal wedding into a 3-season drama series. It was ruthless, yes, but also an unmistakable reflection of how much the public had grown weary of their constant storytelling. That fairy tale wedding, once framed as a fresh chapter for the monarchy, had morphed into the backdrop for documentaries, podcasts, and interviews, all circling the same theme: how unfairly they'd been treated. Johansson didn't have to stretch the truth. She just shone a spotlight on the obvious. The monologue's most cutting moment, though, wasn't about tiaras or palace drama. It was about accountability. She slid into a joke about Meghan's do-it-yourself bath salt recipe featured on a Netflix series now at the center of a lawsuit. After a woman allegedly suffered severe burns, no euphemisms, no softening the edges. Johansson called it what it was and left the audience in that perfect mix of shock and amusement. NBC aired every second without so much as a bleep, ignoring reported requests from Meghan's team to pre-approve any mentions. For Meghan and Harry, this wasn't just a bad PR moment. It was a full-on loss of control. For years, they'd carefully managed their public image, deciding when and how they were talked about. Now, the narrative had slipped through their fingers and late-night comedy was steering the conversation. When satire stops fearing backlash, it's a signal that the cultural tide has turned. Johansson's performance tapped into something bigger than a 4-minute TV segment. It mirrored a shift that had been brewing for years. After the tell-all interviews, the multi-million-dollar deals, and Harry's memoir that read like an unfiltered therapy diary, the public mood had changed. Where there was once sympathy, now there was fatigue. The couple's grievances had gone from headline-worthy revelations to predictable beats in a story people felt they'd already heard too many times. The real sting came from how universal the laughter felt. It wasn't just the usual anti-Sussex crowd nodding along. It was the type of broad bipartisan mockery that signaled their image had cracked across the board. In Hollywood, that matters. When A-list comedians start roasting you without consequence, the industry takes note. Executives, agents, and producers pay close attention to audience reactions. And the reaction here was crystal clear. No one was rushing to defend them. By the end of the monologue, Johansson had done more than tell a few jokes. She'd publicly dismantled the carefully constructed aura that had shielded Harry and Meghan since their royal exit. The applause wasn't just for her timing. It was for the freedom to finally laugh at two people who for so long had been treated as untouchable. The fallout didn't just ripple through social media feeds. It crashed into the closed-door spaces where reputations are measured in profit potential. In the days after the monologue, Hollywood insiders began passing the clip around like a litmus test. At CIA and WME, two of the biggest talent agencies in the business, executives reportedly watched the audience's reaction on repeat. The laughter wasn't polite or hesitant. It was full-throated approval. One senior agent was blunt. If Scarlett could go there and get cheers, so could anyone else. That statement alone was dangerous for the Sussexes because it signaled the removal of an unspoken industry courtesy. For years, Harry and Meghan had been insulated by a kind of cultural force field. Even if you didn't like them, you kept your critiques vague, your jokes soft. That was the unwritten rule. Now that shield had cracked, the industry's appetite for protecting them wasn't just fading. It had flipped entirely. Being associated with them was starting to feel like bad business. Quiet whispers began circulating. They were box office poison. Not in the literal sense of a failed movie, but in the broader sense of drawing the wrong kind of attention. Scarlett's roast had another layer of impact. It embarrassed their allies. The punchlines didn't just target the couple. They called out the media figures, celebrities, and corporate partners who had stood by them through every controversy. Suddenly, defending Harry and Meghan looked less like loyalty and more like complicity. In an image-obsessed town, that's a death sentence. No one wants to be the last one holding the bag when the public turns. The Netflix boardroom reportedly felt the sting hardest. The company had invested millions into the Sussex brand, banking on their royal mystique to deliver prestige content, but in reality, their projects had shifted from cultural events to niche gossip fodder. Viewership spikes on release were followed by sharp drop-offs, and critics were openly mocking the output. Scarlett's joke about surviving in a $14 million mansion was more than a gag. It crystallized a criticism Netflix executives had been hearing in private. The couple's narrative had gone from inspiring to indulgent. Archewell, their philanthropic brand, didn't escape unscathed either. Johansson's quip about it sounding like a spa for egos was brutal, precisely because it rang true. Public records had already shown the foundation spending far more on PR than on actual charitable grants. What was meant to be their moral anchor now looked like a vanity operation. Forbes picked up the thread days later, running a piece that questioned what exactly Archewell had achieved since its launch. The fact that a comedy bit could spark serious journalistic scrutiny was proof the couple had lost control of the conversation. Even their personal connections were showing signs of strain. Sources close to Beyoncé's management team made it clear there was no ongoing commercial relationship despite Meghan's past attempts to lean on their brief public encounters for credibility. Other high-profile acquaintances stayed silent, a silence that spoke volumes. When the tide turns in Hollywood, allies don't stick around to fight. They vanish. Inside Archewell's own offices, there was a growing sense of panic. Staffers knew that being lampooned was one thing, but having that mockery resonate across demographics was another. Late-night satire was no longer a fringe threat. It was a cultural weather vane showing exactly where public sentiment was heading. And in this case, the wind was howling against them. Scarlett hadn't just cracked a few jokes. She'd reset the power dynamic. Harry and Meghan weren't setting the terms of engagement anymore, and in an industry built on perception, that shift was lethal. The sharpest cut came when the jokes started exposing details the couple would rather keep buried. One of the night's most memorable lines took aim at Prince Harry's living arrangements and citizenship status. Johansson delivered it with a smirk. A man who's written a book trashing his family, moved to California, enjoys all the perks of life in America, but still hasn't applied for citizenship. The implication was obvious. He wanted the benefits without the obligations. Legal analysts quickly picked up on it, pointing out that his visa status, tax responsibilities, and potential use of diplomatic exemptions had long been murky. The line turned an abstract controversy into a talking point that spread far beyond comedy circles. For Meghan, the scrutiny was equally piercing. The bath salt lawsuit joke wasn't just a cheap laugh. It was a direct hit on her carefully crafted image as a lifestyle authority. Here was a duchess-turned-wellness influencer now accused of pushing a product allegedly tied to severe injuries. That the recipe had been featured on her Netflix show made the situation even harder to ignore. Scarlett didn't fabricate the story. She distilled it into a single cutting remark that stripped away the polish and left the underlying mess in plain view. The wider effect was brutal because it dismantled the couple's control over how their philanthropy, projects, and personal choices were perceived. Their foundation's tax filings were suddenly trending online. People who'd never read a single financial disclosure were sharing screenshots showing Archewell's lopsided spending, where PR bills outweighed charitable grants. The joke about sending your ego to detox had become shorter than for what critics were calling their entire operation, a glossy facade with little beneath it. Inside the media world, this was treated less as a celebrity flap and more as a moment of exposure. Late-night comedy had done what carefully worded op-eds and investigative pieces couldn't. It made the criticisms entertaining, repeatable, and easy to digest. You didn't have to be deeply invested in royal gossip to get the joke. It was accessible, universal, and damning. The backlash didn't come in the form of angry mobs. It came in silence. Phone calls went unanswered. Invitations stopped arriving. Meetings with potential collaborators were postponed indefinitely. PR veterans call this the social cold shoulder. And it's often more damaging than a direct attack because it removes the oxygen of relevance. Without public allies to prop them up, the Sussex brand started looking less like a misunderstood power couple and more like a liability. The entertainment industry's reaction sealed the shift. Writers, producers, and executives who once viewed them as a safe bet for projects began rethinking the risk. If Scarlett's jokes were resonating this strongly, it meant any future venture could be overshadowed by the ridicule. In a business where image is currency, Associating with someone whose name triggers more eye rolls than applause is a gamble few are willing to take. What made the entire episode so devastating was that it didn't rely on leaks or scandalous revelations. It was all drawn from public knowledge. The couple's own choices, their own statements, their own financial records. Scarlett had simply arranged the puzzle pieces in a way that exposed the picture they'd been trying to keep blurred. By the time the clip had finished its viral run, the takeaway was clear. The jokes weren't isolated punches. They were the public's verdict. And in the court of cultural opinion, Harry and Meghan weren't walking away with sympathy. They were walking away as the punchline. Their brand dented not by a political hit or tabloid smear, but by 4 minutes of unflinching comedy that told the truth a little too well.